The state of a game's balance directly affects how fun that game is at any given time, even for non-competitive players. Of course, there's still plenty of fun to be had in games even when you're losing, but it's no fun getting absolutely steamrolled match after match with little you can do about it purely because the enemy team is using a character or perk that's simply too strong. A lot of games regularly have new character releases that straight up break the game as a whole, like Smite had released Bologna, Apex Legends had released Seer, Overwatch had released Brig, and Overwatch 2 had released Mauga, and each of those characters were broken beyond belief, and DBD is no exception. While every game I just mentioned handles monetization and new content releases slightly differently from each other, all but one of them, Overwatch 2, shared a common theme. Anytime a new character gets released, that character is either completely free and unlocked for everyone the moment they drop, or able to be unlocked without spending any money if players save up enough in-game currency for it. With DBD, that is sometimes the case, as original DLCs can be unlocked exactly like that, but licensed DLCs are not obtainable for free at all. You have to spend money on them. And while initially that might not seem like a big deal, we've already passed 14 licensed killers alone, not including survivors like Ashley Williams or Lara Croft. The debate on whether or not Dead by Daylight is pay to win has been going on quietly in the background for years now, going back as far as DBD's first ever paid DLC, the Halloween chapter, which is a perfect place to begin listing every time DBD released a DLC with either a character or perk that was overpowered, meta-defining, or put people who purchased it at a huge advantage over others that hadn't. In other words, every time DBD released a pay-to-win DLC. Pay-to-win DLC 1, the Halloween chapter. With the addition of Michael Myers and Laurie Strode, this DLC completely changed the game for both killers and survivors. Although Myers himself has never been at the top of the tier lists, his perk, Save the Best for Last, instantly became the best killer perk in the game, creating one of the most unique killer metas ever, even 8 years later with the machine gun build. Original Save the Best for Last granted a permanent 33% cooldown reduction on all basic attacks as long as the obsession was alive, which would additively stack with the then current Unrelenting, which did the exact same thing at 22% for an almighty 55% cooldown reduction on basic attacks with no stacking required. This perk was needed for optimal play for 4 months, until Unrelenting was nerfed to only apply to missed attacks, and Save the Best for Last was reworked entirely another 2 months after that. Laurie Strode's perk Decisive Strike also immediately became the #1 survivor perk in the game, with Objective Obsession also being one of the best perks in the game too. Decisive Strike simply granted any survivor who used it a 4th life instead of the usual 3 lives they're supposed to have, and all 4 survivors could use it too, meaning the killer would now need 16 hooks instead of the usual 12 hooks to win. Decisive Strike's reign of terror was so severe that it has a reputation as one of the most overpowered perks in video game history. Objective Obsession, however, would simply grant the user the ability to see the killer through walls, across the map, anytime they wanted. When combined with a voice chat, one player could equip this perk and grant the entire team a huge head start on any chase. While Decisive Strike had numerous changes over the years, it remained completely game-breaking until mid-2021, with Objective Obsession not being changed until just over a month later. This meant that the Halloween DLC was needed for optimal play for a total of 4 years and 7 months. Pay-to-win DLC 2 of Flesh and Mud. The second paid DLC ever added to DBD follows up on the trend of its predecessor by adding another perk that was absolutely required for optimal play: Hex Ruin. The original version of Ruin instantly became the best killer perk in the game, as it had the potential to drastically slow down the rate at which survivors repaired gens, which was becoming an increasingly frustrating issue. Well, as long as a survivor didn't spawn in right next to it and instantly break it, that is. While Hex Ruin did eventually get a complete rework, that rework was still the best killer perk in the game until it got a huge nerf. The first iteration made it so that every time a survivor got a skill check on a gen, they had to hit a great skill check, or else it would regress the gen by 5% and pause progression for a moment. Additionally, great skill checks would not grant any bonus progress, and would instead behave like your typical normal skill check. The second iteration had nothing to do with skill checks at all, and instead made it so that any generators that weren't fully completed or didn't have a survivor actively working on it would automatically regress at 200% of the normal regression speed. The first version disproportionately affected lower skilled survivors more than higher skilled survivors, as bad survivors would struggle to hit any great skill checks at all, effectively rendering gens unrepairable altogether, whereas more skilled survivors would hit every single great skill check and disregard the perk altogether. While it's nice that it rewarded skill, killers dominate in lower tier gameplay anyway, so it just felt practically unplayable for those survivors who were already struggling. The reworked version, however, disproportionately affected higher tier killers more than lower tier killers, making the best killers, who often have high mobility, outperform the weaker killers even further, as high mobility killers can scare survivors off gens more often, forcing ruin value more often, whereas a weak killer like Myers has no mobility at all, and therefore far less opportunity to scare survivors off gens, causing them to regress. With both versions of Ruin, the difference between a match with Ruin and a match without it was night and day. Matches often lasted significantly longer, going from frequent 5 to 7 minute matches to around the 15-minute mark, granting a huge time bonus to get stuff done, have more chases, and ultimately kill more survivors. Ruin was required for optimal killer play for 5 years and 7 months. Pay to win DLC 3, Leatherface. Bubba's always had a rough time, bless him. He's never been a particularly good killer, and although Knockout and Franklin's Demise are both great perks, they've not quite been game-breaking or meta. But despite that, for the longest time, Bubba was one of the most purchased DLCs, and in fact, most players used to recommend buying the Leatherface DLC as soon as possible, even if it was your first DLC, for one single reason: barbecue and chili. The aura reading from Barbecue was a great help in terms of keeping pressure up, and was especially good on high mobility killers like Hillbilly, Nurse and Blight, as they could follow up on that aura reading quite quickly. But the aura reading, you know, the primary function of this perk, wasn't the reason people were flocking to the store to buy it. Instead, it was an old, since removed bonus feature of this perk that granted a permanent 25% blood point boost for each survivor that had been hooked at least once. Back in the day, DBD's grind was absolutely insane, possibly one of the grindiest games ever made. Blood point gain as a whole was lower, everything in the blood web costed more, and prestiging functioned completely differently to how it does now. Every time you prestiged, it used to completely wipe your character, losing every perk, add-on, offering, etc. And instead of instantly granting your teachables to every other character like it does now, instead it just opened up the option of manually purchasing that perk on other characters if they appeared in the blood web. This was only one perk at a time, which meant that if you wanted all 3 teachables on other characters, you'd have to prestige 3 times. That's right, if you wanted barbecue and chili on Hillbilly, you'd have to buy Bubba, prestige him 3 entire times, then start leveling the Hillbilly up and buy all of Bubba's perks on him manually if they appeared in the blood web, each tier one by one. While barbecue didn't break the balance of the game, it was absolutely required in order to keep up with the grind of leveling your current characters, which would start all over again each time a new DLC was released. DBD's old grind was a full-time job. No, seriously, playing DBD was literally my full-time job, and even then I could barely keep up. Barbecue and chili was required to keep up with the grind for just under 5 years. Pay to win DLC 4, Shattered Bloodline. With the addition of the Spirit and Adam Francis, this DLC brought on an immediate shift in the tier lists. While Adam and the Spirit both have fairly popular perks, none of them are game-breaking. The Spirit herself, though, utterly game-breaking. Surprisingly enough, she was actually fairly weak in her initial public test build, with survivors able to happily loop her for minutes at a time even while phasing like it was nothing. But when she was released into the live game, she did so with a whole host of buffs. Longer ability duration, shorter ability cooldown, and the removal of her directional audio turned her into an absolute monster. With no counterplay whatsoever, the Spirit's power level rivaled that of the Nurse despite being significantly easier to play and having no issues in scenarios that would often cause real trouble for the Nurse, such as cluttered indoor maps like Leary's. Turning DBD from a game of skill to a game of luck with her old 50-50 guessing games was controversial enough, but she reached a whole height of new controversy when players started straight up lying about counterplay for her that literally did not exist, like telling people people to look at her shards to tell when she was using her ability or not, when in reality, the shards had no functionality tied to them at all, with some skins outright removing the shards anyway. The community did eventually find one trick working against her. An entirely unintentional bug with animation blending would cause her hair to glitch for a frame or two upon starting her phase, but even that wasn't particularly useful. It showed you when she started her phase, but did not tell you if she cancelled it, where she went, how far she went, how fast she is. There was still no actual counterplay. The killer remained as an overpowered killer able to grant easy wins for 3 years. Pay to win DLC 5, Ash vs Evil Dead. When Ash's perks were leaked early, everybody could immediately tell that if they were put into the game without any changes, they would completely break the game the same way Decisive Strike did. And of course, they were pushed into the game exactly as the leak showed, and to nobody's surprise, Mettle of Man became the new Decisive Strike, granting survivors a 3rd health state instead of their usual 2 completely passively, just like DS did with its extra life. Any survivor players who didn't have Mettle of Man would find themselves playing with 1 less health state than their peers, and so many players resorted to spending a few quid for an extra health state. Mettle of Man was required for optimal play for 2 months, but Ash's story doesn't end here. Pay to win DLC 6, Descend Beyond. Following in the footsteps of the Spirit, the Blight also had a fairly rough time in his public test build, as he had incredibly buggy collision, rendering his ability straight up unusable in a lot of areas on a lot of maps, but his release into the live game was a very different story. Insane mobility putting even the hillbilly to shame, good chase pressure, and on top of that, players quickly discovered bugs that would allow the Blight to do things he wasn't supposed to be able to do, such as dashing around loops with something they called the hug tech, where Blight players would look down at the floor whilst touching a wall, causing them to slide along it instead of bouncing. If you were to attempt this without looking down, your ability is greyed out, as the devs intentionally blocked it off for this very reason. But for whatever reason, looking down stops the ability blocker from kicking in, and thus you could dash around loops. Pair that with the absolutely game-breaking release version of Hex Undying, which granted killers hex perks that would keep respawning every time they were broken until there were no more hexes left, making survivors potentially have to break 5 totems to get rid of Ruin, and of course became the #1 killer perk in the entire game, possibly the most overpowered killer perk seen in DBD to date, and we have a severely pay-to-win DLC on our hands. While Undying was eventually nerfed into a fair perk after 5 months, the Blight remained an incredibly oppressive killer with none of his bugs, nicknamed techs by many to justify the abuse of said bugs, being fixed for years. The Blight remained as this incredibly oppressive killer, winning matches via exploits for 3 years and 8 months. Pay to win DLC 7, Witching Hour. With the addition of Michaela Reed and her introduction of survivor hexes called boons, we saw Boon's Circle of Healing completely take over DBD. One person using Circle of Healing could grant the entire team not just self-care, but a turbo-buffed version of it, alongside the huge bonus of double heal speed for any non-self heals in the range. Survivors would heal up from hits faster than ever, like it was just a scratch, and while one person bringing it in would grant the bonus to everyone on the team, if more people brought it in, then they could apply it to more totems and cover much more of the map. Circle of Healing was needed for optimal play for 1 year and 5 months. Pay to win DLCs 8 and 9, Portrait of a Murder and Chains of Hate. The release of Pinhead added Scourge hooks into DBD, special hooks that gave you bonus effects if you hooked a survivor on them, which makes Pinhead the Scourge hook guy. And Scourge hook Pain Resonance is the Scourge hook perk, the only one that's strong and worth using. And you'd think the Scourge hook perk belongs to the Scourge hook guy, but no, Pain Resonance belongs to the artist, in the Portrait of a Murder chapter. With Pain Resonance, when hooking a survivor on a Scourge hook, it would automatically explode the generator with the most progress, causing it to lose 15% of the maximum progress, as well as kicking the survivor off the gen and making them scream. This was great for gen pressure and map information, as due to that scream, you could hear exactly which gen was affected and then go straight there to pressure it further. Things stepped up a level 2 months after the artist's release in patch 5.5.0, where they went back and buffed Dead Man's Switch from the already present Chains of Hate chapter, allowing it to proc on any hooked survivor instead of just the Obsession. Dead Man's Switch had potential to provide a good amount of slowdown by blocking gens for an extended period of time, but the hard part was getting it to actually trigger by scaring the survivors off of the gen. But Pain Resonance's screaming feature counted as an interrupt, which would force the survivor off the gen, thus almost guaranteeing value from Dead Man's Switch. There was counterplay though. Survivors could just let go of the gen for a second as the killer hooked the survivor, then resume the repair. The gen would still lose 15% progress, but it would at least stop DMS from blocking the gen. Chains of Hate was needed for optimal play for 1 year and 3 months, but Chains of Hate will be making a return later in the video, extending this time further. However, the Portrait of a Murder DLC wasn't finished yet, as 8 months after Pain Resonance's nerf, another one of the artist's perks, Grim Embrace, received a huge buff, also becoming a top tier perk and remaining so to this day. Dead Man's Switch and Pain Resonance also remain as top tier perks to this day. Minus the 8-month gap between Pain Resonance's nerf and Grim Embrace's buff, the artist's DLC has been needed for optimal play for 1 year and 9 months so far. Later, we would see the devs go back and buff Ash's perk Buckle Up, making it grant both the reviver and the revivee endurance upon picking up a slug, combined with Zarina's perk For the People, which allowed you to instantly heal somebody 1 health state at the cost of one of your health states. Survivors could insta-revive a slug and they could both get away scot-free since they both had endurance, which forced the killer into a lose-lose situation. Both of these perks were required for optimal play for 11 months, bringing Ash vs Evil Dead to 1 year and 1 month, and Chains of Hate to 2 years and 2 months. Pay-to-win DLCs 10, 11 and 12, Spark of Madness, Resident Evil, and Sadako Rising. The Doctor has never been in the top 3 killers, and while Feng Min's perks are nice, they've never been overpowered. And for the longest time, the Doctor's perks weren't anything special either, but that all changed 4 years after his release in patch 6.1.0, when one of his perks, Overcharge, received a huge buff that made any gen you kick gradually ramp up its regression speed to a maximum of 200%, which could be combined with Sadako's perk, Call of Brine, to regress kicked gens at 400% speed, thus creating the Overbrine meta. Nemesis's perk Eruption joined Overcharge, also receiving a huge buff in 6.1.0, increasing its regression to 10% and its incapacitation effect to a whopping 25 seconds, which is a long time of being blocked from doing gens. These 3 DLC would all need to be purchased for optimal performance for a total of 9 months. Pay to win DLC 13, End Transmission. In a repeat of Ash's Metal of Man, Gabriel Soma's Made for This was another survivor perk that completely broke the game's core balance. This one instead granting survivors a permanent 3% sprint speed boost as long as they're injured. Not only was the perk game breaking, but many players ended up buying the DLC just for this one single perk, as newsflash, in a game about running away from killers, people will pay money to run away even faster. End Transmission was required for optimal play for 5 months. And I'm sure that people in the comments have already listed plenty more DLCs and perks that I haven't even mentioned here, lengthening the list even more. Now that's a long list, and things definitely don't look good, but there is a second side to the story. First of which is the good old Shrine of Secrets. For those of you who aren't seasoned DBD players, the Shrine of Secrets is basically a perk shop which allows players to use iridescent shards, a free currency obtainable through gameplay, to purchase perks. The shrine gives users a choice between 4 random perks which re-rolls weekly. This includes DLC perks and has historically been the first line of defense against any claims of the game being pay to win. While technically, on paper, this does mean that every single perk in DBD is possible to obtain without spending a penny on DLC, in reality, the odds of getting the perk you want are incredibly low. Remember, the shrine is only 4 perks and it pulls from every perk in the game, both killer and survivor, apart from base perks like Resilience or Unrelenting. Which means if there's a particular perk you need, the chance of you getting it in the shrine is lower than 1.33% each week, which is definitely not feasible for players to rely on. The other defense is that any original DLCs that aren't licensed are also earnable through gameplay via iridescent shards. But what if I told you that that wasn't always the case? It wasn't until mid-2018 that this option was added into the game, which meant that every DLC released before the Spirit was only obtainable with money. Of course, nowadays that's not the case, but that defense didn't always exist. But with 41 paid DLCs available for DBD, including Lara Croft, how many of them are licensed and thus excluded from this rule? 18 of the 41 paid DLCs are licensed, which means about 56% of DBD's DLCs are earnable for free just by playing the game. While that's actually surprisingly generous in my books, anything less than 100% absolutely opens the door to talks of pay to win. What if in the future the best killer is Alma built with full aura or Volt Speed Negan? Then you'll have to call yourself Ricky Dicky Doodah Grimes because behavior owns half of your shit now. And by shit I mean money, because you are not earning those licenses through gameplay. How many times have we already seen licensed perks completely obliterate the game's balance? Decisive Strike, Metal of Man, Eruption, Call of Brine. You can't rely on the Shrine to give them to you, at least not until long after they've been nerfed. Of course, not forgetting the elephant in the room. The second best killer in the game, Blight, is unlicensed and thus obtainable for free, and our undefeated champion, the Nurse, is part of the base game, no unlocking required. But even if the two best killers are free, you can make them even stronger by using the strongest perks, bringing us back to licensed DLCs again. It's a hard discussion to have because the game is more DLC than base game at this point, and they can't afford to make all these DLCs if they aren't getting any money to pay their employees. But then again, if DBD wants to have a battle pass like every other live service, where every new character is free, then perhaps they should follow in their steps too. It's like having your cake and eating it too. They're using a free games monetization model, the battle pass, but still charging for the DLCs anyway. Look at Overwatch 2 for example. They tried making players pay for new hero releases, but eventually had to revert back to making them free for everyone due to rampant pay to win claims. What do you think? Is DBD pay to win?